Hello everyone, on behalf of ANROWS, I welcome you to our webinar today, Using the Client-Worker Relationship to Engage Men Who Use Violence. My name is Michelle Robinson and I'm the Director of Evidence to Action at ANROWS. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land across Australia on which we meet, land that was never ceded, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge and pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are participating in us on the webinar today. Today's webinar, Exploring the Client-Worker Relationship in Men's Behaviour Change Programs, is a panel discussion and it will be followed by live Q&A. So please send through any questions during the course of the discussion and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. Also, the research report and resources related to the webinar are available on the ANROWS website, and they're also available in the handout section on GoToWebinar, the platform you're using. The webinar will be recorded and it'll be available subsequently in the next couple of weeks. You can subscribe to the ANROWS notepad to find out exactly when this will be available. Finally, we're going to have a survey which will pop up as you exit the webinar. And if you could take a couple of minutes to complete it, we'd really appreciate your feedback, as your responses help us to improve as we go forward. So as I said earlier, today's webinar will discuss the research project that was led by Dr. Liz Reimer, Growing to be a Better Person, Exploring the Client-Worker Relationship in Men's Behaviour Change Group Work Programs. As I said, Liz Reimer completed this in partnership with the Men and Family Centre in New South Wales, who run men's behaviour change programs in Lismore and Tweed Heads, and Centrecare, who run a men's behaviour change program in Southport in Queensland. The project was part of the Perpetrator Interventions research stream at ANROWS, which is providing an evidence base for the improvement of systems and services and practice responses to the diversity of men who use violence. Now on to our panel. We have our presenters with us today, and they are really spread all over the southeast or the east coast of Australia. I'm going to introduce you by title, and you will have seen everybody's full title on bio available on the which is available on the ANROWS website. So firstly, I'd like to introduce you, Liz. So Dr. Liz Reimer, Senior Lecturer at Southern Cross University, who led the research project. We also have with us Lizette Twistleton, who is Head of Sector Development, No to Violence, and Lizette joins us from Melbourne. Liz is based, as I said earlier, on the Gold Coast in Queensland. We also have Dr. Kate Seymour, Senior Lecturer at Flinders University in South Australia, and Kate joins us from Adelaide. And Phil Jones, a practitioner with many years of experience, who is currently based at the Men and Family Centre in New South Wales. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks.
I just wanted to mention that this is a confronting topic and some participants may find it distressing. It is really important that you take care of yourself while watching this webinar, and if you would like to access any support, please contact any of the services that we have listed on the screen, 1800-RESPECT, the Men's Referral Service or Lifeline. Okay, let's start. Liz. Your project explored the client-worker relationship in men's behaviour change programs. Could you explain what a personalised client-worker relationship is? And then talk to us a bit about what the research revealed about this project in practice, this approach in practice.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. As Michelle said, I'm speaking from Bundjalung country in the northern New South Wales, southeast Queensland area of Australia. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank ANROWS for funding the research and giving us this excellent opportunity today to talk about the findings. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the Men's Behaviour Change Program facilitators and supervisors who are here today with us. What I'm presenting is the voices of people like you who shared their practice wisdom with me. There were 22 Men's Behaviour Change Program participants, 3 partners or ex-partners of these men, 10 group work facilitators, 7 of whom were men and 3 were female facilitators, and 3 supervisors, and together they were talking about 32 different working relationship dyads. So I've brought an outsider's perspective in terms of my analysis of how these participants understood the working relationship. Yeah, so it's really the voices of, you know, the practice wisdom of the people who are doing this work. Okay, so let's get started. What do I mean by personalised working relationship? I think it'd be great to get cues to start off with from the people involved in the research. And one of the facilitators said, I've got to get this guy on board. I can't collaborate if he's staying separate. So I've got to try to engage him really quickly. I'm not going to do a psychoeducational program with him. All I'm doing is a human being to a human being and trying to get him to recognize that I'm not a threat in any way, shape or form. So in this study, personalised working relationships between workers and participants were talked about as people relating as a human being to a human being. So people relating as a person to a person, not thinking about people as clients and workers, but human being to human being and the inherent worth that we have as human beings. This was really important because what it meant was that the workers didn't see the man as an abuser or a perpetrator or some kind of embodiment of violence. They saw them as a human being with inherent worth. I mean, of course, it's really important to remember that it was for a professional purpose, and that was the underpinning kind of the purposefulness of the working relationship. So the facilitator's balance, this really delicate balance of professional with a personalised approach. Purposeful change was part of the professional quality, challenging men to think and behave differently, but they did it in this way that was caring and nurturing and compassionate. And what this did was created a safe environment which helped the men engage, and it developed this emotional investment between the facilitator and the men, which then created the opportunity for the facilitators to teach the men and challenge the men to think critically or reflect critically about their values and beliefs about violence and about their violent behaviour. So let's have a look at how the workers did this. Well, somewhat maybe contentiously, a really important part of the workers coming across as a human being was that they disclosed elements of their personal self. Again, I'm going to go to the words of a men's behaviour change participant who said, you can see someone who has changed incredibly. He's talking about the worker here. It's just inspiring. It just makes you feel safe. It makes you feel safe to have someone lead the way. I mean, if we had someone there who wouldn't disclose anything, I don't know if I would have shared anything. I would be suspicious of the facilitators. So it's a give and take thing. You know, you get it given to you and it's easier to give back. I don't know why it made a difference. I think it's just that human connection thing. Yeah, just to feel trusted, safe. You trust the situation enough to be safe enough to be vulnerable. So participants, and then on the other hand, participants talked about what their usual experience of professionals was, which was quite different. It was like in terms of surveillance and control and trying to regulate their behaviour, this kind of adversarial approach that's talked about in the literature, where there's this sense of you're labelling me as a violent man, therefore you think I must be undeserving of support. And what that kind of approach the men talked about doing was creating a barrier to them feeling safe, and created a barrier to them feeling they could be honest and open up and kind of make themselves vulnerable. So instead, in terms of these personalised relationships, where the workers came across as a human being, like a person and relatable in that kind of way, like the man in some kind of way, the men talked about how that made them feel safe. And what that then did was it created this openness for them to be challenged, to talk about their attitudes and behaviour, and for the workers to challenge the men to reflect critically on their values that led to that kind of approach. Now, I know that for some of you, this is probably creating alarm bells, because it did for the workers involved in the research. You know, they were talking about things like, well, what about risk of boundaries confusion, and what about risk of collusion? Again, I think one of the female facilitators put it beautifully, where she said, it's slippery work, because you're kind of wanting to create that really safe place that is compassionate and respectful and nurturing, and yet at the same time be really alert to any of the stuff that's going to slip them away back into that space or create an environment where they're colluding together. So in trying to make sense of this kind of struggle that the facilitators had, I learned that collusion actually created, or collusive acts, attempts to collude, created opportunities, and the workers used this attempt to collude, firstly as a kind of a feedback loop for themselves, where they could think, all right, that man's trying to do that. That means that we've still got a bit of a way to go. That was a bit of a feedback for them. But then what the workers did, they used it as a way to then draw attention to how the man was using power, and then create an opportunity to discuss how the man was using power and challenge the man in this safe and positive way that came about from the relationship, to teach the man how to be safe in relationships. So they basically use it as a tool to try to achieve the program goal of change. All right, so wrapping up. Through the personalised working relationship, where the worker sees and treats the man as a human being, they build this emotional investment, which created a safe place to challenge the man, and it created a place where the worker could teach the man to critically reflect on their values and beliefs about violence and why they use violence, which helped build self-awareness in the men, or the men build their own self-awareness about how they use violence. And that, yeah, that's basically what was happening and what the research found.
Great. Thanks so much, Liz. That's been a really useful overview. Now we're going to turn to just check in with Phil for the minute. Phil's on holiday. He's joining us from his holiday to participate. So I'll just let him get settled before we go to Phil, just to check that everything is okay. Can you hear us, Phil?
I can hear you perfectly well. Can you hear me? Great.
We can. Are you in a good space to begin? Yep.
Well, they've just taken me out of the main library and put me in a room, became available, and here I am. And everybody's frozen, but I can still hear you.
Oh, that's great. The Bellingen Library is helping us host the webinar. So, Phil, Liz has just talked to us about the way in which the personalised client-worker relationship can create an environment that's conducive to behavioural and attitudinal change. I'd like to discuss with you whether or not you've seen this in your practice, and how do you ensure boundaries are placed, and what do you do when there's collusion? Like, what's your take on that? We've heard from Liz that it can be used as a feedback loop, and sometimes it can also be used to reflect power relationships and behaviour that workers are looking to change.
Yeah, so thanks, Michelle. I think what I'd let you know is that I wrote a great big response to this, and I think rather than read that out, I will talk about this in a way that feels like it fits and adds to what Liz has been talking about. And because everyone else is frozen, it just feels a bit weird for me. I might need to check every now and then that you can still hear me.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so you can?
Yep.
That's good.
All good.
Okay. So my answer, people who work with me laugh at me because I get asked a question and it looks like I'm not answering it, but I usually get around to answering it by going around in a loop. My answer starts with listening to Fiona Hamilton speaking in a webinar last week. She was speaking about engaging with Indigenous people, and she said that if there's no kinship, we can't work together. And I think that really speaks to all client-worker relationships. And adding to what Liz said, if we don't engage with people in a way that holds their context and them in a space that's of use to them, it's really difficult when we're asking them to change some of the perhaps most shameful and most deeply seated behaviours that they have. So initially, I think that what we are really interested in is how we critically reflect about our own view about how we see someone who uses violence or causes harm. I think without that, if I'm not aware of what my views are and how I see someone, it's going to be very difficult to engage with that person in a way that they're not going to be on the defensive, or most of the men who get sent to our service are already on some sort of defensive space. And so engaging in a way that can slowly remove that, so we can give them some safety I just want to be really careful in talking about safety for men who cause harm, and I really want to talk about the binary type of thinking that we get into, particularly in our sector, and this thinking really concerns me in that it's either or. I'm either working for the safety of women and children, or I'm not. I'm either engaging with a man respectfully, and if I'm doing that and compassionately, then there's this terrible fear that I'm not engaging in relation to the safety of victim survivors. And to effectively work with a man to ask him to change, there needs to be some foundation for him. There needs to be some space where he can. Are you still able to hear me?
Yep, you're still with us.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, there needs to be some space where he can go to some of the places that are really, really uncomfortable for him and really difficult for him. And so the question is, how do we ensure that we're holding the safety of victim survivors as paramount to our work while still engaging with someone who's causing harm? And for me, the answer lies very much in seeing the humanity, seeing this person as a human being who has context, and that context is really important for that particular person. It's not necessarily important for the person that he's causing harm or the people that he's causing harm to, but it's incredibly important to him. And so if we can create that type of safety, that type of foundation for him, then as Liz already spoke about, we're going to see lots of attempts from him to engage us in his story that are attempts at collusion, is what we really see them as. And the critical self-reflection that's needed for me is to understand that it's not, I can see him as a human being, I can treat him with respect, I can engage with him, I can do all of those things. But that doesn't mean that I agree with his behaviour, doesn't mean that I'm supporting him in his behaviour, doesn't mean that I agree with his views that are deeply seated about women or about what it means to be a man and all of those things that we understand as the drivers. So I'm able to engage with him in a very personal way, in a way where I can share myself, as Liz said before, and he can see that I'm not actually part of a punitive system that just sees him as a high-end perpetrator who's just a bad person, that he can see that I can see his humanity, and that creates some space for him to be able to move in to the difficult work of him challenging himself. I'm really interested in how we talk about accountability and what we do with accountability. I'd just like to touch on it really briefly, is the idea that floats around men's behaviour change sort of sector, is that we must hold perpetrators to account. And the problem that I have with that is that it's missing one of the vital sort of points, in that holding someone to account is the use of some sort of dominance. It's using some power over in some way, which is the very thing that we're sort of asking him not to do. And whether it's conscious or not, I've never worked with a man who can't see through that. Men understand that, they see that, they know what's happening to them. So the idea of this work is to be able to create a space for him to be able to hold himself to account, to create a space where he's willing to challenge himself around how he behaves and what he does. And one of the things that we often do is that we ask him to look at the impacts of his behaviour immediately at the very beginning of the work. And I think it's oh, there I am. I think it's something that needs to have a lot of skill and a lot of care taken, because for most of the people that I've been working with, they need to see themselves first before they can start looking at other people. And so if we're pushing them to look at other people first, my concern is that we're actually creating more of the same sort of problems for people. Yeah. So I think I'll just end on this. There's so much more I could say, but I'm aware of time. There's an early childhood axiom that says there must be connection before correction. I think it fits really nicely with men's behaviour change work. I think there's a whole lot of early childhood work that fits really nicely with men's behaviour change work. So is that answering the question or would you like me to keep going?
That's fabulous, Phil, and there will be an opportunity to loop back in as well during the panel discussion, but I think that that's really set us up very nicely for the next question to Lizette. Thanks, Phil. And yeah, we can still see you. It's a little bit blurry, but you're there, and you're coming through very clearly. The audio is fine.
Thanks, Michelle.
So Lizette, the research talks about the emotional load often experienced by facilitators and supervisors in men's behaviour change programs. And from what Phil has just described in terms of making that connection, we can see that that would be very much the case. In your experience, how does this work? Or what is the impact of this work on practitioners, and how can services and management provide support?
So I think, and Phil started to touch on it, that sense that we actually need to be holding victim survivors' safety and well-being at the core of our work, while we're actually diving in kind of into a really personal space with a user of violence and starting to talk and have conversations with him. So we're hearing from both sides different and often very different versions of the story of the stories of what's happening in that family. So there's an emotional load of how do I keep victim survivors close to me in the work, and for me, you know, it's always a sense of how do I hold them really close so that they're kind of sitting at my shoulder, if you like, and how do I then also genuinely engage with this person who's using, you know, horrific violence and coercive control and really impacting severely on the lives of those people in his family. How do I hold the breadth of that and bring my skill to the work to be able to have those difficult conversations around that? So that in itself is quite an emotional load. And then I think, you know, given that we all come to the work, you know, with our own histories and stories and unconscious bias, and so there's an emotional load there as well of like, how do we look after ourselves in this work? How do we look after each other in the work? So that to me speaks a lot about, on an individual level, the need for practitioners to be able to do that really deep self-reflection, do personal work that's necessary to be able to sit in that space. And I think that applies to everybody who's doing the work. And I think for you know, being the only woman in a room in a group, there's an additional emotional load of carrying what's often seen as kind of carrying that responsibility to speak for all of the women and children and victims of violence in the room. And I think that's a journey that has to happen between the two facilitators around how you support that. And of course, sometimes I believe that, you know, female facilitators bring such an important strength to the work, and a different way of working with the men that kind of can feel like you're sometimes holding a lot of that emotional load in the group. So you know, for me, that work is really important. That having really good debriefing processes where the facilitators are encouraged to be able to have robust, honest conversations with each other, support each other in the work, but also challenge each other and kind of let each other know when you feel like you were let down or you were on your own, or somehow, oh, Phil, you're really clear now. So that when you're in the room, there's a tightness there. There's a tightness and a fluidity. So I think in the work there's a lot of contrasts that are happening, that we're working with a lot of contrasts and instead of going, it's either this or this, we're saying it's all of this, and how do we hold that in the work? Clearly having really good supervision and you know, qualified external supervisors on a regular basis and on an ad hoc needs be. I think having really clear processes and policies in your organisation that talk about the support that's needed for facilitators, that there's processes for dealing with any difficulties that facilitators have with each other, that a facilitator has with a particular client, because we're all human. We're all going to have clients, even no matter how much work we do, we're going to have clients that we go, I'm just really struggling with this person. So ways of managing and supporting staff in that. Going back to what Phil was saying, that sense of being able to genuinely meet men where they're at, and that needs to be supported by the organisation. And I think we talk about, and also it kind of connects to that accountability piece. We are accountable we are the ones who are accountable in the work as well. So we've got accountability to each other in the work, we've got accountability to victim survivors, and we've got accountability to the service system. So that it's really clear that we're holding that accountability, and we're working with men to understand what personal accountability means for them. So those kind of things need to be really well articulated. I think ensuring that workers have really good professional development, so they're able to attend conferences, that research is really encouraged, that conversations about the latest practice and research is kind of alive and well in an organisation. That we recognise that we don't work in a silo, that we work within our integrated service system, and how important that is, so that there's time to attend interagency meetings and kind of lift our head out of that space of just being a facilitator. And this is a tricky piece for a lot of programs that are largely really underfunded and are reliant on sessional group workers. So, and I think there's something there that's about accountability of the system back into the programs, is how do we build a system where programs are really well funded, and people who are doing that really edgy upfront work with men who are using violence are actually supported to be able to do all those things, and they're not just dropping in to run a group. So that's a big sort of systemic sort of shift that needs to happen within our whole sector across the country. Just checking my notes. I think I've kind of covered everything really. Yeah.
Is that a change that you can see happening, or is it yet to happen?
I think it's starting to happen, and certainly at No to Violence we're doing a huge piece of advocacy around this, and recognising, and this is something that's come up really strongly during COVID, where we've had people moving, where we've had to move from group face-to-face service into really holding large numbers of men engaged through telephone work, through perhaps a technology facilitated engagement, a FaceTime or a Zoom meeting, which means that that casualised workforce is either just not there enough, and they haven't got the hours to be able to work, and it's being carried by often managers or team leaders. So I think that it is a really big issue. It's been really revealed during COVID, and we're certainly doing quite a lot of advocacy that programs need to be funded really well to not just do the group work, but the one-to-one work and the case management work that needs to happen in programs.
Great, thanks, Lizette, and we will come back to COVID. But I just wanted to throw to you, Kate, because you're also a practitioner. What has been your experience of what is the impact of working as a practitioner in the field?
Yeah, well, I can certainly talk about my practitioner experience, but also research around that. And I guess one of the ways that I came into research was coming from a practitioner perspective, and was involved in a piece of research that was actually around speaking with people who ran, the facilitators of group work with men who use violence. And one of the things that struck me most clearly about that, once I was getting through those interviews, was how blind I had been myself to some of the profoundly gendered impacts of the work. And so I guess it really there was this irony of how you can be in it and you need to actually step out to really recognise some of this stuff. But what came through from the interviews with practitioners was a really very clear differentiation between the gendered impacts of the work in terms of how that impacted on men and women. And I was really quite struck by that, having newly stepped out of practice. But the very strong themes were around that for most of the men that I spoke with, so the male workers, there was a sense of, I mean, for everyone, this is work that's stressful, it's difficult, it's incredibly difficult in all sorts of ways, and that was so for both men and women. But that whereas the men talked about the work and kind of, the gendered focus of the work as, in a sense, kind of revelatory, I guess, that it enabled them to sort of grow as people and grow as men and, step into a different kind of sense of being a man. That was so that was quite an important part of the work. Women talked about the work as impacting on them in a way that was fundamentally about diminishing, because, and that wasn't anyone's fault. It was just that the gendered, you've already got a gendered workplace and you've got a particular area of work that is highly gendered because gender is in the centre of the room with this kind of work. But for women, there was a whole lot of work that came with that, which was unique to them, which was around some of the stuff that Liz had talked about. So, the kind of emotional labour associated with that, but also the way that you carry gender relations from, everyday life into that space, and they don't just disappear because you're in a men's group. So the kind of challenges that women have around challenging men and challenging their, the peer worker, the workers that they're facilitating with, so feeling like they had to kind of carry the tone of the group and speak up for and identify when things, where they could see things that the man couldn't, and had to actually kind of argue for those things. So it was some of that kind of stuff, but also the work that the women talked about in terms of kind of having to manage themselves and so as not to appear too feminine or too harsh. So they were very conscious of the way they dressed, the way that they, their gestures, the way they talked, and that kind of stuff. And in some, the work had kind of made them much more aware of gendered structures and gendered oppressions that carried across their whole life and really impacted on the way that they, had relationships and the way that they saw men and women. Whereas for the men, it just didn't have that. They were certainly becoming much more acutely aware of that stuff, but it didn't have the same diminishing impact on them as men as it did for the women as women, both as workers and as women. So there were some very clear differences, and they were quite profound in terms of the impact on the women in that group, but they didn't talk about it much. So it was seen as, this is important work. It's important for men and women to work together and to model a different way of working. And so that became almost a kind of taboo on saying, but actually it's really bloody hard. It's really, I'm finding that really difficult personally. So I guess that for me was having come out of practice, and the fact that I hadn't really cottoned on to this, even though I knew it, but I didn't know it to speak of, that this is a huge kind of elephant in the room.
Was there a comment that either as practitioners, Phil or Lizette, you wanted to make before? I'm going to segue into COVID, but I just wanted to offer you both an opportunity to comment in relation to what Kate
I'd like to make a quick comment, and then I'm sure I'd love to hear what Phil has to say as well. So around that, I think for me, this is where the role of really good supervision and I think there's something about having really clear guidance around what supervision is for. And it's, you know, it's both, how do we sometimes work out some of the difficulties we might have around engaging with a certain client, but that relationship, and both the personal relationship of those two facilitators, but then how does an organisation support that relationship, and the difference of a woman who's a facilitator and a man who's a facilitator in that group. And I think being able to have those conversations around, I feel like I'm doing, and I know I can remember myself bringing this up many times over many years in supervision and saying, I feel like I'm the one who's actually calling out things, and I don't want to be that one all the time. I'm happy to do it when I see it, but I don't want to feel like I become the police person in the group, because then that also feeds into a whole notion of men in the group of how they see women. And I'm wanting to, we're wanting as a team of co-facilitators to actually present a different way of relating to men as well. So there's something there. It's really important that relationship is a modelling. And so if men in the group see that it's the woman who's always raising things, or is sometimes maybe making that stop and say, can we just stop for a minute and have a little reflection on what's just happened here, and we need to have a little bit of a dive in there, then that can be really unhelpful.
Yeah, that's perfect, Lizette. Exactly. Yeah.
So if I can, I think it really speaks again to that inner look. I don't think that we can do this work, and I'm a man who's been doing this work for a long time, and if I'm not willing to be open-minded and to have a sense of, I don't need to be superior, I don't need to be the captain of the group, I don't need to be the boss, all of those things, if I'm not willing to kind of look at that, if I'm not willing to take some ownership of my propensity towards that and my willingness to let that go, we are all going to be in strife. And I think it's really important that we understand that we're actually modeling a relationship. And part of what we're asking is we're asking men to behave differently when they have an emotional response to something. We're asking men to maintain being respectful and safe to be with at all times. And so if I can't maintain my own sense of, I can see some of what's happening. I can't have a woman's perspective, but I can see some of what's happening. I'm willing to speak about it, but also holding the balance of not just overriding, not just sort of stopping, holding all the space in the room. Those sorts of things can be really challenging. There's also a very important thing that I don't know whether we name it very often, but we're talking about being in a room where there might be up to 15 men, and at least 14 of them are self-confessed misogynists. And there's only one woman in the room. There's a balancing act that's treacherous at times. Treacherous isn't quite the right word, but that's really a difficult balancing act to walk, of wanting to be supportive of the female facilitator, wanting to give her plenty of space, plenty of agency, all of those things, and also wanting her to know that I've got her back no matter what, but then not stepping into rescuing or using my kind of masculinity or power over. So it can be a really, really tricky space, and we're trying to be modeling how to do this interaction at all times. And so we're trying to model. I've had moments in group where I've thought, oh, you can't say that to me, and had to go, oh, of course you can. I haven't acted that out so that everyone else saw it, but I'm willing to look at myself. So if I'm asking men to change, I have to be in that space myself. You can't take my rigidity in there. It doesn't work.
Thank you. I think it's so rich, and you both, all three, have spoken to the binaries and the balances that are required in this work, and that constant keeping that in view. So COVID, this is how has COVID impacted on the client-worker relationship? And Lizette, I'll get you to start, but in particular, the way that that the work is done to ensure the safety of women and children.
I think it still is. It has been and still really steep learning curve and stretch for our sector. As I said earlier, we've moved from face-to-face, one-to-one and group work, primarily group work, and some cases case management work, to individual work, and individual work across a large number of men who are not just the men who were in a group when COVID started, but all the men who are coming in as well. So that I think has really stretched workers, has stretched organisations, and we're seeing, I think, a sector that's under a lot of duress. Workers are talking about a sense of feeling burnt out, that of being really concerned about the risk that they're holding, and if they're having that conversation with him, where is he in relation to the rest of his family? If he's in the house, is he in the backyard? If he says he's in another room, is he actually in another room? Some organisations have talked about doing some really clever work of ensuring that the family safety contact worker will actually call after the worker has called the man, so that he's actually engaged in a conversation when there's an opportunity to call in and have a conversation and check in with her and ask her how she is. So I think it's even brought us more out of our silo of work, and recognising that we are importantly part of a much bigger service system. And I think that the work that some of the work we're doing at the moment is starting to really look at how do we increase the number of family safety contact work, successful family safety contact work invitations that happen, that we have more impacted family members engaged, because that's the way that we can really then gauge what's actually really happening in there, and if our engagement with him is increasing risk or if it's starting to decrease risk. And that's a really important piece of work, particularly when we know that families have been largely isolated, and we know that isolation is one of the tactics of coercive control, and so for a lot of users of violence, this is a perfect storm for them, and the impacts then on the family are really dire, and we're really like our colleagues working in the victim survivor space, really concerned about the safety of families.
Yeah. We are running behind, so I'm going to just go to the report very briefly. I'd like to hear from Liz the number of recommendations, because these are really important in terms of policy and practice, with a brief response from Kate before we go to questions, because I think some of the issues you've just raised, Lizette, will come out in the questions as well, and we can talk back to those. So Liz, would you like to highlight the key? I mean, you didn't, you couldn't have known about COVID before you did it, but what are the key recommendations for policy and practice that you've identified?
Well, I'm going to help you be really quick with this, because I actually think Lizette's covered pretty much everything that I was going to talk about. So to policymakers, I would say the key thing would be flexibility, like making sure that the sector is able to be flexible in the way that they engage with people. And then my second point now would be go and talk to No to Violence, because I think they've got it covered. Then in terms of for managers and organisations, again, it just sounds like the leadership that's coming out of No to Violence is exactly along the lines of what I'd recommended in the report anyway. So, it's about this ensuring that there's good support available, making sure that people are well trained in critical reflection, and that's another area of my research. It's incredibly hard to teach, and people think they teach it well, but they don't. So there's actually a lot of work that pedagogically needs to still be done related to how to teach and learn critical reflection. So I think it's important for managers and organisations to stay up with the new research that's happening in that space. And then the other thing I would say is create a collegial workplace, a workplace where women and the male and female supporters facilitators are well supported. There's a lot of respect, and there's a lot of even caring and nurturing going on, and there's a lot of even modelling of the kind of relationships that they're kind of trying to develop with the men. And supervisors, my recommendations would be along the same lines. Learn how to do supervision well in a way that you're helping people critically reflect, and create, use these same principles to create good working relationships with your staff, so that people feel safe to talk to you about what's going on for them. That would be pretty much it.
Yeah, so honing in on workforce development, capability and capacity building.
And flexibility.
And flexibility in the workforce itself. So there's some authorising environment, changes required as well. Kate, what do you see as the main policy or system level changes required to move away from the more punitive approaches?
Yeah, I think that all of what Liz and Lizette have talked about, absolutely. I think the stuff that we don't talk about quite so much, because it's kind of so obvious, I think, is that it's the next level up. So yes, there can be better work practices and better supervision, etc. But we have to connect this to the structural, to the structures which shape, power relations in a more fundamental sense. And so as long as we focus on kind of better supervision or whatever, which is absolutely, of course, is the case, we have to shine the light more on some of those structural factors that keep us all very embedded in the way things are. And I think that part of, there's a whole lot of levels of that, but partly that's around being much more critical about, policies like the national plan, etc., and to be, speaking back to those much more in the way that men are framed in particular ways, as, either the problem or the solution kind of thing. And I think that, that goes throughout society, and it's not just about men who are violent, in inverted commas, because I think, that there's a whole lot of other behaviours and attitudes that are actually violent, but that we don't name as such. And I think as long as we talk about things in that, without acknowledging the connections between, behaviours and attitudes and ways of thinking that support violence, then I think we're very much sort of sitting in a bit of a dead-end street. So I think that absolutely there needs to be flexibility about programs. We should be thinking about programs or intervention in a much bigger way, that it should be, much more enduring. Not a 12-week program is never going to do it. It always has to be much longer. It needs to be long-term. But also we need to, embed this within broader ways of thinking that's much more careful about the way we talk about men and women, and the way that gender discourses and violence discourses actually reinforce each other and all that kind of stuff. So it's the really hard stuff that's hard to know where to start with, but we've got to move, we've got to shift the conversation.
I'm going to turn to questions now. We've had over 50 questions, and there's some sort of general themes coming up. Phil, this is the first one for you. One of our roles as police is to ensure perpetrators of family violence are held to account. Do you see a role for police in men's behaviour change?
Wow. It's a really tricky question just to kind of answer straight off the cuff with only a couple of minutes. I think if we just sort of hark back to what Kate's saying about some of the broader structures as well, I think, the police play a very big part in that. And I think if I'm to think about what men's behaviour change is about inviting a man to do something different. And when we talk about accountability, which, it feels a little like I'm repeating myself, but I can't hold someone to account. That's the state's job. I can support someone to change. So without an understanding of what it is that I'm actually going to be doing in my interaction, and I don't know how we invite the police into this space where the question that Lizette put forward earlier was, are we part of the problem or are we part of the solution? And crisis systems so often are part of the problem. But the overall idea is that we're part of the solution. But sometimes if we haven't done the work, if we don't know how, if we just see men who cause harm as perpetrators, how are we going to be anything other than part of the problem? So to think about how the police might sit in that is it's just too big, kind of overwhelms me a little bit with the idea of how do we incorporate the police? Because there's definitely places and times where some of these men do need to be incarcerated. They're not suggesting that's not the case. Safety of the community and the people in their lives, the victims, survivors, is paramount. It has to be. So there's a place for incarceration, but if we're genuine about asking someone to change, how do we meet that person where they are and support them into a space where they can look at things differently and then act things differently? And like Kate said, it's a very long game. Safety of women and children and victim survivors is immediate. Men's behaviour change work is the long game.
And I guess looking at that broader systemic response, how to, the next question in this sort of area is how to manage this engagement with multiple systemic supports across multiple organisations, for example, mental health, drug and alcohol, youth justice. Lisette, would you like to respond to that in terms of what happens across the sector? Is it integrated?
We would hope. I think we're on a journey of building integrated practice and building competency across all of the sectors. For example, one of the projects that's happening with one of my team members is a statewide coordination of AOD and mental health advisors across Victoria. So, that family violence advisors. So I think there's a huge piece of work, and this goes to as well to what Phil was saying about the police. There's a huge piece of work of building family violence competency across the whole sector. Clearly, we hold that specialist kind of space where we're working with men at that pointy end. Yeah. But we actually need everyone to be having conversations with men and engaging with men and understanding how to identify risk, how to have some of those conversations, where to refer him to, because men, we now talk about keeping men in view because largely they were invisible before. And so how do we bring them into view? And we bring them into view by everyone having eyes, but also having the ability when they have those interactions with him, wherever it is, whatever the service is that he turns up at, where there's competency for those workers and going, I can have a conversation, I can start having a conversation, I don't have to feel afraid about having a conversation with him about, his family and how things are in his family without going into the kind of the complex work that's part of change work, and that kind of increasing risk. So that's hence the competency, so people know what's my role, what is my level of competency, how do I engage? And then I think we have to have a system that's funded so that people can do that collaborative work, because integrated practice takes time. It takes building relationships. It takes maintaining those relationships. It means picking up the phone and having a conversation.
And that segues into the next major theme that's come through is safety and how to keep partners and children experiencing domestic and family violence safe while engaging with those who choose to use violence. And I'd suggest that that's part of that integrated system.
Absolutely. And I think, and this is a conversation that's really, as Phil said right at the beginning, it's at the heart of our work. We do the work to keep women and children safe and to increase safety for them, and while engaging him in that journey of change and looking at his beliefs, attitudes and behaviours. And so it's really important that we don't lose sight of that. But I think what we need to build better capacity and have stronger supports for where family safety contact work is happening, and find ways to improve that, because I think that it's and we're doing some communities of practice around this and some support around writing guidance, because it happens differently across different organisations. Some of it's in-house, some of it's contracted out to an external organisation, and how do we hold women and children there in the sense of being able to reach out and offer support to them when they need it.
And another, we've got room for one more, I think, in terms of this is another theme coming through in the questions from today, is how to keep partners and children children as victim survivors who use violence against family. What does behaviour change look like for this cohort? Phil, did you want to have a go?
Sure.
We talked about a little bit about this earlier, but.
Oh, look, again, I don't know if I'm going sideways, but there's a question for me in that of how do we behave towards a 6-year-old who's lashing out, and how do we behave towards a 9-year-old who's lashing out? How do we behave towards a 13-year-old who's lashing out? How do we react or respond to a 19-year-old who's lashing out? How do we respond to a 26 or a 36 or a 46-year-old who's lashing out? And when do we change from holding some compassionate understanding, redirection and care into that person's a perpetrator of domestic violence and therefore is no longer worthy of our respect or our compassion or our engagement? They're just sort of in that kind of bad space that it's really much easier for us to do that rather than to hold the context. And you know, I bang on about this all the time, and I'm sorry about that. The context for victim survivors of the person who's harming them is irrelevant, but the context for the person who's harming them, if we're going to ask them to change, is vitally important that they are seen and heard. And how do we let people know that in seeing and hearing them, we're not abandoning the victim survivors, we're not taking them out of the picture? So, you know, I don't know exactly whether that's answering the question specifically, because I think, you know, the questions, again, it's so broad, and you know, all of these people that we're dealing with are all individuals as well, and there's a whole range of difference. And so I think that if, oh, sorry, Michelle, but if we're able to see people as people and responding to their context in a way that we don't approve of the response, but we understand the context, I think that can change something for us. I'm not sure if
Can I just quickly add something here? I know we're just about out of time. I think that the issue of particularly young people, adolescents and young people using family violence is really important, and I don't think we have the answers or the responses to that yet. And we certainly know that during COVID there's been a massive, you know, really concerning escalation of perpetrators being identified as young people using family violence against siblings or parents. And like many, I think for us it's around how do we work alongside specialists who work with young people, to help develop program responses that really are going to be effective of meeting those young people where they're at, and hopefully being that interrupter and circuit breaker for them so that they don't go on to be those men that Phil's talking about that we end up working with, who have had a lifetime of it, you know. So, and just being really clear, it's not about making an excuse, but we know that it's something that actually is live in the room when you're sitting there with a group of men and they start sharing their stories. Once again, that's a key thing of like, how do I engage with him without colluding with him about the fact that he's experienced violence and he's got a lot of trauma there? How do I hear that, hold that, and then come back to tell me, you know, what's happening here and how's this impacting on how you're treating your family right now? So, yeah.
Kate, did you have a comment that you wanted to make?
Oh, no, it's fine. No.
We have only a room for one more, but there's another, Liz.
I was just going to say, I agree with what Phil was saying. It's the working relationship is different to the program or the intervention, and so the same principles apply. And in fact, I've done the same kind of research in family work, and there was the similar kind of findings. So I don't think it matters what age the person is; they're still a person, And so if you start with the same kind of principles of how to work with someone in terms of these personalised working relationships, then I think that's a good start. And the other thing is, in terms of the stuff Lizette was talking about, you know, the system of service providers, another thing I know about the working relationship is it's very easy for workers, a prior worker, to make it incredibly difficult for a future worker if the working relationship was done badly. So I think what's really going to help across the service system is where workers across all the service system are doing these kind of working relationships, because it means there's already a level of trust that's going to be there for the next worker that comes along to work with that person.
It's about respect, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And treating the person as a human being.
And I think that's where we're going to end up. That's a really perfect place to stop. Thank you all so much. I mean, we could go on. There's so many more questions. We have come to 2:31. So before I go, I'd like to say thank you very much to the panel for making yourselves available across the East Coast. It's been a wonderful sharing of both your insight and your experience and your expertise in the area. And I think there's a whole lot more conversation to be had. And Liz's research report and the research to policy and practice paper that accompanies it are both available on the ANROWS website. So thank you all. Thanks Lizette, thanks Liz, thanks Kate, and thanks Phil. It's been a really, really interesting and very rich conversation. I'm Michelle Robinson. Thank you everybody, and goodbye.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.